So I'm here with Don Guerra of Barrio Bread, and I wanted to ask him some questions about sourdough starters. So I made a sourdough starter, and it was horrendous. It grew weird things. It smelled funny. I started it over. It still smelled funny. How do you start a sourdough starter? What would you say are like the exact breakdown if you have no idea what you're doing?
You know, a good way to go is to start with equal parts flour and water.
Okay.
So that's a good balance. Equal parts flour and water. And the flour, it could be a makeup of all whole grain flour, all bread flour, and you know, most of the time when I start a new one, it's going to be a half and half. So half whole wheat, half bread flour, so half the white flour. Mix those two together, and then add those flour and water equal components.
Okay.
And then if you're starting from scratch, you can leave that mixture out, which would be pancake batter consistency, and leave it out for about 48 hours. Usually, about 48 hours, you're going to notice some activity. You're going to see some bubbles in it, and sometimes, the starters, they start out with a little bit of funky smell.
Yeah.
It smells a little off, but really the key is after 48 hours, after you see life in it, start to feed it on a regular schedule to develop.
So I don't feed it for the first 48 hours.
Right, yeah. If it's just from scratch and you're not using someone else's inoculant or seed culture from scratch, leave it out for about 48 hours. In my bakery, after about 24 hours, I have a lot of activity just because of the nature of my environment.
Yeah, because you have yeast already in the air, right?
Yeah, so, and it's just all over, so I can kind of bump start it. But yeah, in your home, 48 hours, you'll notice some activity, and then at that point, what you'll do once you start to notice some activity and see some fermentation is to kind of keep resetting it or breaking it down and refeeding it. So if you start out with, say, 500 grams of flour and water mixture, you let that ferment, 500 grams flour, 500 grams of the water, 48 hours. And then at the end of the 48 hours, you'll probably want to take part of it out and then feed it new flour and water. So take out.
So what do I do with that part that I took out? Just throw it?
You could probably the best thing to do is to toss it. You know, you can reuse it, maybe in pancake batter, but it's still really young at that point. The thing about starters is you will have to throw out portions. Some people don't like to do that, but really you're increasing the strength of your colony. So through building it and letting it ferment and then breaking it down and then building it back up, you're increasing the strength of the colony, the wild yeast and bacterial cell colony.
So how many days does it take from when I first started to when it would be a sourdough starter that I could use?
I'd say about 4 days, 4 or 5 days, you should be able to try to use it.
So, and now how do I know it's done?
You want to see that it doubles or triples its size after feeding it. So after you feed it, you want to see a lot of growth, which will be a lot of the gassing of the starter, a lot of the CO2 that's the byproduct of the fermentation will start to inflate that water flour mixture, and it'll grow, it'll rise just like a bread dough.
And I would see that within 2 to 3 hours after feeding it?
Yeah, after about 8 hours, you'll see where it's about double or triple.
Do I have it sit out that entire time?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I came across when I was reading about this and trying to figure it out for myself was that they were saying that you're feeding it like every 8 hours. Like every 8 hours you should be feeding this thing again and stirring it when you can and all of that stuff. Would you agree with that advice?
Yeah, I'd say to get it going, it could be at ambient temperature. So at 48 hours, that whole 48 hours is at room temperature. And then once you start to feed it for about the next 2 days, I would say, best bet, every 8 hours, 12 hours, feed it, get it to grow, just so it gets in this really strong cycle of this strong growth cycle. Okay,
so breaking it down again, excuse me. Breaking it down again would be that you would have, so you start out, you have your 48 hours, and then you're going to cut that amount in half so you can add new food and water to it.
Right, new flour and water.
Yeah. At that point, which flour are you using? White flour again?
It really depends on preference.
Okay.
I use an organic bread flour, sifted bread flour, because that seems like the most predictable starter for me, and I'm used to using it.
Yeah.
Whole grain starters are going to make a little bit more activity, a little bit more enzymatic activity in the dough. So it ferments a little faster.
Okay.
But after you get it strong, you kind of switch to the flour you want.
So if you were saying wanting to keep it local, would you use a flour from Hayden Mills?
Yeah.
What flour would you recommend for something like that?
I really like the Hayden Mills Hard Red Spring.
Okay.
They make a bread flour out of the hard red spring. And that's just a really nice strong flour, and it has great aroma. You know, the thing about starters, they can impart some of their flavor, not only leavening activity and potential, but also to impart some of the flavor.
Okay. So, all right, so I've gotten 4 days in, and I've been, at that point then, every time I've been feeding it, I've been reducing the amount of starter that I had in my initial starter holder, right? Like every time I throw out some.
Right.
But by the 4th day, at that point then, is that my mother starter?
Yeah, that would be your mother starter. And after you start to see it, double and triple after you feed it, it should double or triple after about 8 hours of feeding it flour and water.
Okay.
It'll grow. And that's when you know you have good activity.
Okay.
Enough activity where it's going to leaven bread.
Okay.
And at that point, you can start to refrigerate the starter. After you know you've got liftoff and everything is going well, then that could be your seed culture that you're going to store in the refrigerator and then bring out when you're ready to bake. Take a piece of that, feed it more flour and water, get it to grow, but all the while maintaining that mother culture. Whatever you take out, you put back in.
Okay, so that's the next part, right? So we've gotten the starter going, and now we can refrigerate it. So when I'm feeding it, if I'm feeding it but I'm not going to be baking that day, how do I approach that?
Yeah, so what you could do is just to manage it, and if you're going to have very regular baking cycles that like go a week without baking, but you still want to refresh it, I would say bring it out, your seed culture out of the refrigerator, let it warm up for a couple hours, feed it flour and water, equal parts flour, water, and inoculant or seed culture.
And that's what I had originally, like in the mother. Now, am I still leaving some of the mother in the fridge, or is that the whole thing?
That's the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And then after you refresh it, then leave it out for about 2 more hours and then put it away.
Okay.
And then after, your starter will get on a cycle.
Okay.
Your seed culture will be strong enough where it's rising after you feed it. It's potent enough to leaven bread.
Even when it's in the fridge.
Yeah.
And so now that's an everyday feed cycle?
Actually, you could go like a week without baking. If you go a week without baking, you would want to do that process once a week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
So when you're not using it, just keep it in the fridge, and the cold environment will keep it at a very, very slow rate of fermentation.
Okay. So I only need to, and then now if I'm using it for baking, then so I take out the amount that I needed for baking, and then I just replace what I took out by new flour and water.
Right.
Okay. So theoretically, I'm saying with like the same amount, I shouldn't like continually be getting more and more starter.
Right. Yeah. For example, if you have like today, we made a 450 gram starter. So that would be your seed culture. You would tuck that away in the fridge. When you want to bake, you'd pull that 450 grams out. Out of that 450, you would take a 150 gram piece. You put it in a separate bowl with flour, with 150 grams flour, 150 grams water. Stir that up. That mixture is now 450 grams.
Yes.
And now you have your mother culture. Now you want to reset the mother culture by putting 150 in a new container of the mother culture. 150 flour, 150 water, you're back up to 450.
And then I just can put it away.
And now that way you can let it maybe
let it
an
eat
hour or two.
Hours,
and then put it away. And then over here, you fed that flour and water with the mother culture, let it develop 8 hours at room temperature. And then at that point, it'll have reached a strong fermentation and be ready to leaven bread.
Okay.
So you want to get that starter right before you use it.
Okay.
So it needs to kind of digest that flour and water that you fed it for 8 hours, and then it'll be ripe and ready to the point where it's going to go into more into bread dough, more flour, water.
And it'll make it rise.
And
Awesome. Well, that actually makes it a lot clearer than most of the stuff I came across. There were a couple things also that I came across that I wanted to ask you about really quickly. One of them was that I read that if you wanted to have more sourdough, one of the options would be neglecting your starter a little bit.
Yeah, that'll just make it more acidic.
Okay.
So like we talked about, over fermenting it means the pH is lowering and it's producing more alcohol.
Okay.
So sometimes people equate that tanginess with over fermentation.
Okay, so some people might want that, but technically that's an over fermentation.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly the leavener is there for strength, and then it's really about, my take on the acidity levels is how you treat the bread after it's formed.
Okay.
How long you extend out the final proof.
And that's
or the
where
final
you get your
retarding.
from.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like after I go through the whole process, a 4-hour bulk fermentation, an hour bench rest, the final shape. After that final dough is shaped into the banneton, and then I might decide to put it away in the refrigerated environment, 40-degree environment for 12, sometimes 20 hours, some 24. Some people really extend that out to see what happens. but that's what's really going to produce the acidity.
Okay.
So you really want to focus on the strength and potency of the starter, and maybe not mess with that so much, but kind of play with the final proofing to bring forth that acidity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Makes sense?
Yes.
Okay.
One other question was, so I know that not everyone goes, so you go for a 1-to-1 ratio. Why would you go for any other ratio of flour to water in your starter?
Yeah, mostly just to have like a rate. If you have a really strong starter and you maybe have a warm environment, you might have less inoculant, less mother culture you add with the refreshing, because it'll still develop pretty quickly.
Because it just goes like crazy.
Especially if you're using stuff that's like whole grain starters, you might not need that strong of inoculant. You could cut it back to like maybe 0.5% inoculant or mother culture to 1 part flour to 1 part water.
Okay.
And that might be enough, because usually those whole grain starters are pretty potent once they get established.
So it's just kind of playing around to figure it out.
Yeah, and it's just really your preference. And sometimes, I encourage people to keep with the 1-to-1. But at that point, and you get comfortable, then you can start to play with it. Make it your own bread.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Do you think that everyone can and should do a sourdough starter?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
It's so fun. Even if you were to just try and experiment, I do this for kids classes. It's just give them their little science experiments. So just give them flour and water, put a little mother culture in there, and then they can see that this batter becomes alive. These wild yeast and bacterial cells want to jump in there, inflate it, and they see, they have something that they can look through a clear container and see some activity and know that, hey, science is at work, science in nature.
Awesome.
So it's good for the kids to see that.
Cool.
But adults too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Pleasure.
So if you like Barrio Bread, you can get it from the Tucson CSA. You can also order it from his website, and that's barriobread.com.
Barriobread.com.
Right? So that is how community-supported baker Don Guerra sells his bread. Check him out, and thank you again so much, Don.
Thanks so much. Great day.
Oh, all right, we're here.
Yeah.
Hey!
Get that orange bucket in the background.
Can you hide it?
Yep. Awesome.
That's how we roll.
Great.